What if the greatest king in history made sure no one would remember him? Imagine a ruler so powerful that his name once echoed across continents, whispered in royal courts, feared on battlefields, carved into mountains of stone. A king whose armies never seemed to lose. A king who didn't just inherit power, he expanded it, shaped it, defined an era around it. His banners darkened horizons. His laws reshaped societies. His voice alone could decide the fate of thousands. Now imagine that same king ordering every trace of his existence to be destroyed. See the flames rising as ancient scrolls curl into ash. Ink dissolves into smoke. Pages that once recorded victories, treaties, and triumphs crumble into nothing. Hear the crash of statues pulled down from towering pedestals. Marble faces shattering against stone floors. The sound echoes through palace halls that once roared with celebration but now stand silent, abandoned, empty. An empty throne sits beneath fading torchlight, not because the king was overthrown, not because he was defeated, but because he chose to vanish. He conquered kingdoms. He rewrote laws. He bent history in his direction. And then he did the unthinkable. He erased himself, not just from monuments, not just from coins, but from memory, from the future, from the story of his own civilization. Why would a ruler at the height of absolute power choose oblivion over immortality? Was it fear? Guilt? A prophecy too terrifying to ignore? Or did he discover something about legacy, something so dangerous, that he decided the world would be safer without his name? By the end of this video, you won't just know what he did. You'll understand why a king would destroy his own legacy. And why, despite his efforts, history still remembers the silence he left behind. Long before his name was carved into stone, before armies marched beneath his banner, before entire nations trembled at the sound of his arrival, he was just a second-born son in a quiet corner of a fading kingdom. He was never meant to rule. Born into a royal household overshadowed by war and debt, he grew up watching his father struggle to maintain control over lands that were slowly slipping away. The court was divided. Nobles whispered behind silk curtains. Generals blamed politicians. Politicians blamed fate. And in the middle of it all stood a young prince who learned very early that power was fragile. Unlike his older brother, who was trained for ceremony and diplomacy, he was drawn to strategy. While others attended banquets, he studied maps. While nobles argued about tradition, he studied supply routes and crop cycles. He spent time with soldiers, farmers, and merchants, listening more than speaking. He learned how hunger shaped rebellion, how pride shaped war, how fear shaped loyalty. Then fate intervened. When his brother died unexpectedly during a border conflict, the kingdom was left unstable. The nobles hesitated. The generals doubted. Foreign enemies circled like vultures. And suddenly, the quiet second-born son was thrust onto the throne of a kingdom that many believed would not survive another winter. His enemies expected weakness. What they got was calculation. In his first year as king, he didn't rush into battle. Instead, he reorganized the treasury, restructured military command, and introduced strict but fair taxation reforms that stabilized the economy. He replaced corrupt officials with competent administrators, even if they came from humble backgrounds. That decision alone shocked the aristocracy. Talent, not bloodline, became his standard. Then came his first real test. A neighboring warlord, convinced that the young king would crumble under pressure, invaded from the north. The kingdom braced for disaster. Instead of meeting the enemy head-on, the king cut off their supply lines, redirected river routes, and used terrain to trap them in unfamiliar land. Within weeks, the invading force surrendered, not because they were slaughtered, but because they were outmaneuvered. The victory changed everything. Whispers turned into belief. Soldiers began calling him the Mind of Iron. Merchants praised his stability. Farmers saw harvests protected under his policies. Even rival rulers began studying his methods. He didn't fight wars recklessly, he ended them efficiently. Every campaign expanded the kingdom's borders, but also secured trade routes and strengthened infrastructure. Roads were built, fortresses reinforced, schools established to train scribes and engineers. He wasn't just conquering territory. He was building a system. Under his rule, the kingdom entered what historians would later call its golden expansion. Crime rates dropped. Trade flourished across distant regions. Art and architecture reflected a renewed sense of identity. Massive monuments were erected, not only to honor the gods, but to symbolize unity and order. Yet admiration always walks beside fear, because while the people respected him, they also knew he was capable of ruthless precision. Rebellions were crushed quickly. Traitors were dealt with publicly. He believed stability required strength, and strength required consequence. Those who stood against him rarely got a second chance. Foreign ambassadors described him as calm, almost cold. He spoke little in negotiations, but when he did, his words carried finality. He never appeared impulsive. Every action felt 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He became more than a king. He became an idea, a symbol of discipline, of strategy, of visionary leadership. Children grew up learning about his victories. Songs were written about his campaigns. His face was stamped onto coins that circulated far beyond his borders. Other rulers sought alliances rather than confrontation. His empire stretched farther than anyone thought possible when he first took the throne. And yet, behind the strength and brilliance, something was shifting. Because as his power grew, so did his awareness of how fragile power truly was. He had mastered war. He had mastered politics. He had mastered prosperity. But his greatest decision was yet to come. Under his rule, the kingdom did not just survive, it transformed. Markets that once struggled with scarcity now overflowed with goods from distant lands. Spices arrived from the south, silks from the east, metals from the mountains beyond the frontier. Trade routes that had once been dangerous were now protected by royal patrols, making commerce faster and safer than ever before. Taxes were structured with precision, light enough to encourage growth, firm enough to sustain the treasury. For the first time in generations, the royal vaults were full not because of plunder, but because of prosperity. Farmers benefited from irrigation systems he personally commissioned. Engineers redirected rivers, built canals, and introduced new farming techniques brought from conquered regions. Harvests doubled. Famine became rare. Grain reserves were carefully monitored and distributed during harsh winters. People no longer feared the changing seasons the way they once had. The cities reflected this transformation. Stone roads replaced mud paths. Public bathhouses and libraries were constructed, not just for nobles but for common citizens. Education expanded. Scholars were invited from foreign lands to debate philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. The kingdom became a center of knowledge, attracting thinkers who once would have ignored it. Art flourished. Murals painted across palace walls depicted not just battles, but unity. Farmers, soldiers, craftsmen all shone as threads in the same fabric. Musicians composed symphonies celebrating peace instead of conquest. Poets described the king as both sword and shield, fierce in war, protective in peace. Then there were the monuments. Colossal statues carved from white marble stood in city squares, capturing his likeness in calm authority. Towers stretched into the sky, their foundations engineered to withstand time itself. Bridges connected regions that had once been isolated by geography. Each structure was designed not only to serve a purpose, but to send a message. This kingdom was permanent. Foreign envoys walked through the capital in awe. They described it as a city that gleamed under sunlight, as if blessed by fortune itself. And people began saying something that spread from marketplaces to royal halls. Everything he touched turned to gold. But perhaps his most impressive achievement was not economic or cultural. It was military dominance without constant war. The army was restructured into disciplined units, trained not just in combat but in logistics and engineering. Fortresses along the borders were reinforced with innovative designs that made invasions nearly impossible. His reputation alone deterred rebellion. Neighboring kingdoms chose treaties over conflict. Pirates vanished from trade routes. Bandits were systematically eliminated. For years, peace reigned, not because the world had grown kinder, but because no one dared to challenge him. And yet, power at that scale changes something inside a man. It began subtly, a decree here, a small change there. He ordered older records to be revised. For accuracy, he claimed. Chroniclers were instructed to emphasize unity over individual generals. Certain events from early campaigns were quietly removed from official archives. No one questioned it at first. Kings adjusted narratives all the time. But then the decrees became stranger. Statues of past rulers were relocated from public squares. Some were replaced entirely. When advisors asked for explanation, they were met with silence or vague responses about long-term stability. Meetings with his council grew shorter. Invitations to strategic discussions became fewer. He began spending long hours alone in the palace's inner chambers, reviewing documents personally instead of delegating. Access to royal archives became restricted. Even trusted advisors found themselves waiting outside doors that were once always open to them. Whispers began. Not rebellion, just confusion. Why was a king at the height of unmatched success tightening control over history itself? Then came the secret meetings. Late at night, small groups were summoned quietly through side entrances of the palace. Not generals, not economic ministers, scholars, record keepers, architects, even sculptors. They would enter carrying scrolls and leave empty-handed. Guards were sworn to silence. Scribes were reassigned without explanation. The palace corridors, once alive with collaboration, grew tense. He still appeared strong in public, still decisive, still calm, but those closest to him noticed a shift, a weight behind his eyes, a mind constantly calculating something no one else could see. Prosperity continued. The empire remained powerful. The people celebrated festivals under lanternlit skies, unaware of the subtle changes unfolding behind stone walls. Everything still looked golden, but gold under enough heat can melt. For years, no one could point to the exact moment everything changed. There was no public scandal, no visible defeat, no famine, no rebellion strong enough to shake the empire. On the surface, the kingdom still stood unchallenged. But something happened. Some say it began with a prophecy. An old seer, brought quietly into the palace during one of the king's secret meetings, delivered words that were never officially recorded. Rumors claimed the prophecy spoke of a ruler whose name would one day drown his own empire in blood. That future generations, inspired by his legend, would fight endless wars trying to reclaim a lost greatness. That his legacy, not his enemies, would destroy everything he built. Others believe it was betrayal. A trusted general, one who had fought beside him since his early campaigns, was discovered plotting in secret. Not to overthrow him, but to secure power after his death. Letters were intercepted. Plans discussed succession, influence, control of the army once the king was gone. It forced him to confront a terrifying truth. Loyalty often survives only as long as power does. Then there are those who whisper of guilt. Hidden beneath the empire's golden age were campaigns never fully told. Entire villages wiped out in the early years of expansion. Rivals eliminated quietly. Political opponents imprisoned without trial. Decisions made in the name of stability, decisions that no monument ever displayed. Perhaps as peace settled and the noise of war faded, those memories grew louder in his mind. And the most dangerous rumor of all, the one never spoken aloud in public, was about his bloodline. Some claim he uncovered proof that he was never the rightful heir, that his brother's death had not been fate, but manipulation, that his claim to the throne rested on a truth too explosive to survive exposure. If the foundation of his rule was illegitimate, then everything built upon it, every reform, every conquest, every monument, stood on fragile ground. No one knows which story is real, but everyone agrees on one thing. After that moment, he was not the same. The calm strategist who once balanced ambition with patience began to withdraw into himself. His decisions became less about expansion and more about control. He spent hours staring at old campaign maps, tracing borders with his fingers as if trying to calculate the cost of each line. His sleep grew restless. Servants reported hearing him pacing long after midnight. Advisors noticed how easily he dismissed praise, how rarely he smiled during public ceremonies. Victories no longer satisfied him. Applause no longer moved him. He began asking strange philosophical questions in council meetings. What is a king without memory? Does history belong to truth, or to the one who writes it? Is it better to be feared forever, or forgotten completely? The questions unsettled even his most loyal ministers. Then the actions began. At first, it was subtle revisions. He ordered royal scribes to amend early records of his reign. Specific battles were reframed as collective victories rather than personal triumphs. His speeches were edited before being archived. References to his direct command were reduced. Next came the monuments. Stone carvers were summoned back to statues that had stood proudly for years. His name was chiseled away from plaques. In some cases, entire inscriptions were replaced with generic dedications to the crown or the unity of the realm. When citizens asked why, they were told it was a matter of humility, that the king wished to honor the people instead of himself. But humility does not require erasure. Soon, entire statues disappeared overnight. Then the libraries. Royal archivists received sealed orders to surrender original manuscripts from the early years of his rule. Some were burned in controlled courtyards under guard supervision. Others were locked away in vaults no historian could access. Chroniclers who resisted, who argued that history must remain intact, were accused of treason. And treason, under his rule, had only one punishment. Public executions of respected historians sent shockwaves through the intellectual community. These were not rebels, not conspirators. They were scholars, men whose only crime was preserving memory. Fear spread faster than any decree. Writers began censoring themselves before the crown could. Families hid private letters mentioning the king's early life. Merchants quietly melted coins bearing his face, unsure if possessing them would become illegal. The people began to whisper, not in open rebellion, not yet, but in markets, in taverns, in dimly lit homes after sunset. Why is he erasing himself? Some believed he had gone mad. Others believed he was protecting them from something unseen. A few feared something far darker, that he understood a truth about power and legacy that ordinary minds could not comprehend. The most chilling part was this. He was not acting out of rage. He was methodical. Each record destroyed was accounted for. Each monument altered followed a structured order. This was not chaos. It was strategy. The same strategic brilliance that built the empire was now being used to dismantle his own memory. And the kingdom, once unified under his golden touch, began to feel something new for the first time in decades. Uncertainty. The decree did not arrive with celebration or ceremony. It was delivered in silence. One morning, sealed scrolls bearing the royal insignia were dispatched across every province of the empire. Governors were ordered to gather their councils immediately. Military commanders were instructed to read the contents privately before sharing them with no one but their most trusted officers. When the scrolls were opened, the message was clear, cold, absolute. From this day forward, the king's name was not to be spoken, written, carved, recorded, or remembered in any official capacity. All monuments bearing his likeness were to be dismantled. All inscriptions referencing his reign were to be removed. All coins stamped with his image were to be recalled and melted. Any document preserving his personal legacy was to be surrendered to the crown. No explanation, no justification, only obedience. At first, many believed it was a test, perhaps a lesson in humility or discipline. But when enforcement began, no one doubted the seriousness of the order. Royal guards entered the Grand Library at dawn. The building had stood for generations, housing records older than the kingdom itself. Scholars pleaded for time to review the materials, to at least preserve neutral records of events. Their requests were denied. Shelves were stripped. Manuscripts were carried into the courtyard in wooden crates. By midday, smoke rose into the sky. Scroll after scroll was thrown into towering flames. Ink that had taken years to perfect dissolved into ash within seconds. The smell of burning parchment filled the capital. Citizens watched from a distance, stunned, as knowledge vanished before their eyes. And it did not stop there. Across the empire, statues were toppled with ropes and hammers. Marble faces that once symbolized strength shattered against cobblestone streets. Craftsmen who had proudly sculpted his likeness were ordered to deface their own creations. Some wept as they struck the stone. Others refused and were swiftly replaced. In marketplaces, officials established collection points for currency. Coins bearing his profile were confiscated in exchange for newly minted replacements stamped only with the royal crest. No face, no identity. Massive furnaces burned day and night as gold and silver were melted down, reshaped, stripped of memory. Even private homes were not exempt. Soldiers conducted inspections, searching for hidden portraits, letters, or heirlooms that referenced the king by name. Families buried keepsakes in gardens. Some burned their own belongings before authorities could find them. But the most tragic transformation occurred within the halls of scholarship. Chroniclers, once respected as guardians of truth, were summoned individually to the palace. They were presented with a choice: swear an oath of silence and amend past records to remove his identity, or face charges of treason. Many complied, hands trembling as they erased years of work with their own pens. A few refused. Their executions were not loud spectacles. They were deliberate, controlled, almost administrative. A message not of rage, but of inevitability. The crown would tolerate no resistance against forgetting. Fear settled over the empire like winter frost. Children were corrected if they spoke his name aloud. Teachers adjusted lessons to describe the former ruler without specifics. Over time, even conversations grew vague. People began replacing his name with phrases like the one before or the silent king. It was working. His identity was dissolving from daily life. But history is harder to kill than stone. In a quiet chamber beneath the remnants of the Grand Library, one historian made a decision that would change everything. He was not the most famous scholar, not the most powerful, but he had served under the king since the early campaigns. He had witnessed both the brutality and the brilliance. He had recorded victories, reforms, and private speeches never meant for the public eye. When the decree reached him, he obeyed publicly. He surrendered official copies of manuscripts. He stood in the courtyard as pages burned. But that night, under cover of darkness, he retrieved a hidden draft, a complete chronicle of the king's life, written in meticulous detail. Not propaganda, not praise, truth, the triumphs and the shadows alike. He wrapped it in oil-treated cloth to protect it from moisture. He sealed it inside a wooden case and bricked it behind a false wall beneath the ruined archive. He knew the risk. If discovered, he would not receive mercy. But he also understood something the king perhaps hoped no one would grasp. Erasing memory requires total obedience. And total obedience is impossible. Years passed. The statues were gone. The coins replaced. The libraries rewritten. Generations grew up without ever knowing the name of the ruler who built their roads, their walls, their prosperity. The king had nearly succeeded. Nearly. Because if you are hearing this story, it is because someone disobeyed the king. Because one historian chose memory over fear. Because even the most powerful ruler cannot fully extinguish the human instinct to remember. And buried beneath stone and silence, the truth waited patiently for rediscovery. By the time the erasure was fully underway, the question was no longer what he was doing, it was why. A ruler who had mastered strategy, governance, and war does not suddenly begin dismantling his own legacy without reason. His actions were too precise to be madness, too structured to be impulse. Whatever drove him, it was deliberate. One explanation whispers of a curse. In ancient courts, prophecy was never taken lightly. Kings rose and fell based on omens, eclipses, and the murmurs of mystics. If he had been told that his name itself would one day ignite destruction, that future rulers would wage endless wars in imitation of his conquests, the weight of that knowledge could have been unbearable. He may have realized that legends outlive wisdom, that future generations rarely inherit context, only ambition. If his story became myth, myth could become obsession. Obsession could become bloodshed. Perhaps he concluded that the only way to protect the future was to deny it a symbol. Remove the name, remove the banner, remove the rallying cry. No hero to worship, no golden age to reclaim. In that sense, erasing himself may have felt like sacrifice rather than surrender. A king choosing obscurity over becoming the spark of future ruin. Another theory is far more strategic. Power does not disappear when a king dies, it shifts. And legacies are dangerous weapons. If his empire was as vast and prosperous as it seemed, his name carried enormous influence. A rival claimant could rise decades later declaring, "I am the true heir of the great king." Rebellions could gather under the nostalgia of his reign. Ambitious generals could invoke his memory to legitimize coups. He understood politics better than anyone. He knew symbols mobilize people faster than reason ever could. By erasing his identity, he may have been preventing his legacy from being weaponized. Without a personal myth, no one could manipulate it. Without a named hero, no one could claim descent. The throne would belong to the institution, not the man. But strategy alone does not explain the severity of his actions. There is a darker possibility: guilt. Empires are rarely built without buried bones. The early years of his expansion were swift and ruthless. Entire regions resisted assimilation. Villages burned as warnings. Rivals disappeared quietly. Official records glorified decisive victories. But the private archives, the ones he later destroyed, may have told a different story. If peace gave him time to reflect, those memories might have resurfaced with unbearable clarity. The faces of civilians caught in crossfire. The screams silenced for stability. The brother whose death paved the way for his crown, whether by accident or design. If he had any hand, direct or indirect, in that brother's fall, the throne itself would have felt poisoned. Every monument a reminder, every cheer an accusation. The golden age built upon a moment of betrayal. Erasing himself might have been an attempt to erase the guilt. If no one remembered him, perhaps the blood would no longer echo through history. Perhaps future generations would not celebrate a reign that began in darkness. But the final theory is the most chilling: control. From the beginning, he believed that power lay not only in armies or wealth, but in narrative. He reshaped economies. He redesigned cities. He reorganized military command. He understood systems. And the most powerful system of all is memory. History defines identity. Identity defines loyalty. Loyalty defines power. If he controlled how the past was written, he controlled how the present functioned. And if he removed himself from the past entirely, he achieved something unprecedented. He would become untouchable by time. Think about it. A king criticized can be judged. A king remembered can be debated. But a king erased becomes a void. And voids cannot be attacked. If I control the past, I control reality. By eliminating records, he wasn't just removing his name. He was demonstrating ultimate authority, the ability to reshape truth itself, to decide what existed and what did not, to prove that even history bowed to his will. In that sense, the erasure was not weakness. It was the final display of dominance. He had conquered lands. He had conquered rivals. Now he was attempting to conquer memory. Whether driven by fear, protection, guilt, or absolute control, one thing becomes clear. This was not the act of a broken ruler. It was the decision of a man who understood that the most dangerous battlefield is not fought with swords, but with stories. In the final years of his reign, the palace no longer felt like the center of an empire. It felt like a monument to silence. The grand halls that once echoed with strategy meetings, music, and diplomatic negotiations stood half-lit and hollow. Torches burned lower. Curtains remained drawn even during daylight. Servants moved carefully, speaking in hushed tones, as if sound itself had become dangerous. The king no longer appeared regularly before his court. When he did, the difference was impossible to ignore. His posture was still upright, his voice still controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He no longer looked at people, he looked through them, as though constantly measuring invisible threats, as though calculating possibilities no one else could see. He reduced his council to only 2 remaining advisors. Then 1. Eventually, none. Decisions were delivered in writing instead of spoken aloud. Meetings were replaced by sealed instructions slipped under guarded doors. Even the commanders of his army were denied direct audience unless absolutely necessary. Isolation became routine. Guards were doubled outside his private chambers. Access to the inner palace required multiple authorizations. Entire wings of the royal residence were closed indefinitely. Dust began gathering in banquet halls once prepared for hundreds of guests. The throne room, the symbolic heart of the empire, remained empty for weeks at a time. Whispers of paranoia spread. Some servants claimed he believed assassins were hiding among his own staff. Others said he feared something less tangible, not blades but memory. That he was terrified someone somewhere still preserved his name. That despite his decrees, a fragment of his identity survived beyond his reach. He ordered inspections of archives again. Ordered new searches of noble estates. Ordered confirmation that statues had not been secretly rebuilt. Reports were brought to him daily, and he reviewed them personally, line by line. Sleep seemed to abandon him. Lamps in his chamber burned through the night. Guards reported hearing pacing footsteps long after midnight. At times, muffled conversations drifted through the door, though no one had entered or exited. And then, there are the final words. They survive only because one attendant, tasked with replacing oil lamps, later whispered them before disappearing from court entirely. Whether they were written, spoken, or imagined, no one can prove. But the account remains. On his final night, he reportedly stood alone in the throne room. No crown, no armor, just a simple dark robe. The torches cast long shadows across the marble floor where his statues once stood before being removed. He looked at the empty pedestals, and he said quietly, "A king remembered becomes a legend becomes a banner becomes a war." He paused, running his hand along the cold stone of the throne. "If they cannot remember me, they cannot misuse me." Then softer, almost to himself, "Let the kingdom live. Let the man disappear." The next morning, the palace doors remained closed. There was no official announcement, no royal procession, no mourning period declared across the empire, no public confirmation of illness or assassination. Simply silence. The guards at his chamber were reassigned. The royal seal transferred quietly to his successor. The machinery of the empire continued operating as if nothing had happened. No funeral procession marched through the capital. No tomb was unveiled. No monument erected. It was as though he had followed his own decree to its final conclusion. He did not fall in battle. He was not overthrown. He was not publicly buried. He faded. And in doing so, he accomplished something almost impossible for a ruler of his magnitude. He died the way he had chosen to live his final years. Unseen, unspoken, unrecorded. An empire remained, but the king was gone. Not just from the throne, from history itself. The transition of power happened so quietly that most citizens never realized they were living through the end of an era. There was no grand announcement declaring the king's death. No empire-wide mourning. No official rewriting of events because the rewriting had already been done. The throne simply became occupied by another ruler, introduced not as a successor to a legendary monarch, but as a continuation of the crown. The institution survived. The man did not, and time did what time always does. It moved forward. Children were born into a kingdom of paved roads, fortified borders, vast marketplaces, and towering monuments. But when they asked who built them, the answers were strangely vague. The crown commissioned it. The realm expanded during earlier years. Our ancestors established this. No name. Teachers carefully avoided specifics. Histories described events without attributing them to a singular figure. Wars were mentioned without generals. Reforms were discussed without authors. The Golden Age became a period rather than a person. Within a generation, the absence no longer felt unusual, felt normal. Imagine walking through a capital city filled with architectural marvels, bridges engineered with precision, aqueducts that still carried water flawlessly, statues in public squares where inscriptions had been deliberately smoothed into blank stone. The physical achievements remained undeniable, but their creator was gone from memory. Travelers from neighboring kingdoms found it unsettling. Foreign diplomats possessed older records, fragments that still referenced a powerful ruler who had once dominated treaties and negotiations. Yet when they attempted to discuss him openly, local officials responded with polite confusion or careful silence. Some neighboring courts believed the empire was hiding political instability. Others suspected internal rebellion had wiped out a tyrant. A few thought perhaps the stories of that great king had been exaggerated all along, myth mistaken for fact. Without confirmation, speculation grew, and over time, even foreign records began to fade. Trade continued, alliances shifted, new leaders rose elsewhere. The world adjusted to the empire's quiet refusal to acknowledge its most transformative figure. But the deeper consequence was internal. A civilization that forgets part of its origin develops a subtle fracture. Policies existed without clear philosophy. Military doctrine remained effective, but its strategic brilliance lacked context. Scholars debated how certain economic reforms began, yet could not trace their intellectual roots. Innovations were preserved, but the mind behind them was erased. It was as if an entire chapter had been torn from a book, and the remaining pages continued the story without ever addressing the missing section. Some elders, those who had been children during the final years, occasionally felt a strange hesitation when speaking about the past. A memory on the edge of recall, a face they almost recognized. But fear and time are powerful erasers. Eventually, even those faint recollections dissolved. The statues that had once displayed his likeness now stood as abstract monuments. Blank pedestals became symbolic of unity rather than absence. Coins without faces circulated so commonly that no one questioned why earlier currency had ever required one. The erasure was nearly complete, and perhaps the most haunting detail is this: the kingdom did not collapse, continued to function. Harvests came and went. Armies defended borders. Festivals were celebrated. Children laughed in streets built during his reign, unaware of the mind that designed them. His greatest fear, that his legend might cause future destruction, never materialized. His greatest ambition, that his empire would endure, did. But without him, in the end, the paradox is unavoidable. He achieved exactly what he set out to do. No grand myth formed around his name. No cult of personality shaped future rebellions. No ambitious warlord invoked his legacy to justify conquest. His identity dissolved into silence. He succeeded. The world forgot him. Centuries passed before the silence cracked. Empires rose and fell on the same soil. The once glorious Rajdhani became layers of stone buried beneath newer foundations. Earthquakes fractured old walls. Floods reshaped districts. What had once been the center of power slowly transformed into a relic studied more for architecture than authority. It began with a routine excavation. Archaeologists were reinforcing the remains of what historical records vaguely described as the Old Royal Archive. Most scholars believed the site had already yielded everything of value decades earlier: pottery fragments, partial columns, foundation maps. Nothing extraordinary, until a section of wall collapsed. Behind it, hidden by deliberate construction, was a narrow chamber no larger than a storage room. The air inside had been sealed for centuries. The stonework was different, newer than the surrounding structure at the time it was built, as though added in haste. Inside the chamber were 3 discoveries that would fracture everything historians thought they knew. The first was architectural. The walls themselves bore faint outlines where inscriptions had once existed. Careful examination revealed chisel marks, not erosion, not decay, but intentional removal. Names had been carved out with precision. Entire lines of text deliberately erased from stone. The second discovery lay beneath layers of debris, a fragment of a statue's base. The pedestal inscription had been violently scratched out, but under angled light, indentations remained. Enough to trace letters. Not fully readable, but enough to confirm something chilling. There had once been a name, repeated, prominent, systematically destroyed. The third discovery was the most explosive. Hidden inside a sealed wooden case, wrapped in oil-preserved cloth that had hardened with time, was a manuscript. Fragile, faded, but intact. It was not propaganda. It was not a myth. It was a detailed chronicle, early campaigns, political reforms, private reflections, strategic philosophies. It described a ruler whose rise transformed the kingdom into an empire. It detailed victories long attributed to the crown alone. It even hinted at the decrees ordering his own erasure. Most hauntingly, near the end of the manuscript, the tone shifted. The historian who wrote it began describing the king's fear of legacy, his obsession with controlling memory, and the systematic destruction of records. The final line of the manuscript read, "If this survives, then memory survives. And if memory survives, then he was wrong." Scholars were stunned. For generations, historians had debated why that empire's golden expansion lacked a central figure. Now they had proof. There had been one. A ruler powerful enough to reshape history, and bold enough to attempt to delete himself from it. The implications were staggering. How many other figures across time had attempted similar erasures? How many civilizations contained silent gaps disguised as lost records? Was this an isolated act of obsession, or part of a broader pattern where power sought to dominate not just the present, but the past? The rediscovery ignited global fascination. New excavations began across the former empire. More scratched-out inscriptions were found. Melted coin molds were uncovered. Evidence confirmed the manuscript's claims. The erasure had not been accidental decay. It had been policy, calculated, coordinated, nearly successful. Nearly, because despite burning libraries, demolishing statues, melting currency, and executing historians, one hidden chamber had survived. One manuscript endured. One voice refused to vanish. And through that single act of defiance, the king's existence resurfaced centuries later, not as a flawless legend, not as a tyrant, but as a paradox. A ruler powerful enough to conquer the world around him, but unable to conquer time completely. The king who erased himself almost won. History is full of kings, emperors, and conquerors whose names are etched in stone, inked in manuscripts, and sung in ballads. Yet what happens when a ruler attempts to defy the very force that gives power meaning, memory? The story of the king who erased himself forces us to ask questions few dare consider. What is legacy, truly? Is it the monuments we build, the coins we mint, or the battles we win? Or is it the echo of our choices in the minds of those who come after us? This king had it all: wealth, power, influence, and an empire that seemed eternal. Yet he chose to remove himself from history. His actions suggest that legacy is fragile, not because monuments crumble, but because memory is selective. A single manuscript hidden beneath stone can outlast empires. A story told by one courageous historian can undo centuries of erasure. Legacy is not in what we build, but in what survives our attempts to vanish. Can power defeat time? He tried. With armies, decrees, and fire, he attempted to bend memory to his will. But time moves independently of intent. Preserves, it obscures, it reveals. No decree, no execution, no burning of libraries can truly erase the past. Even the most meticulous ruler cannot control the curiosity of those who come after, the questions they will ask, the fragments they will uncover. Power may shape the present, but it cannot permanently imprison memory. And then there's the haunting question: is being forgotten worse than being hated? Many rulers in history are remembered for cruelty, conquest, or injustice. Their legacies are debated, vilified, or glorified, but they are remembered. This king chose oblivion. No praise, no blame, no remembrance. In erasing himself, he attempted to protect his kingdom, his people, and perhaps even himself from judgment. Yet, in doing so, he surrendered the one thing that immortalizes rulers: influence. To be remembered, even hated, is to exist beyond death. To be forgotten is to wrestle with the emptiness of one's own absence, even after power has ended. Maybe the only thing more powerful than a king is memory. It is memory that immortalizes triumph and tragedy alike. It is memory that preserves wisdom, warns of mistakes, and inspires action. Kings may build walls, shape laws, and command armies, but they cannot command what humans remember. Memory is the invisible empire that no crown can conquer. In the end, the king who erased himself reminds us of a paradox. One can control lands, people, and even stories, but not the act of remembering itself. His reign ended in silence. His name was almost lost forever. Yet here we are, centuries later, reconstructing his story from fragments. Memory survived, and in that survival, it claims a power far greater than any throne, army, or decree could ever hold. As the story closes, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. History is never complete. What we read in books, what we see in museums, even what we are taught in school, it is only what survived. Entire lives, entire empires, entire legacies can vanish, deliberately or by accident. If a king powerful enough to control an entire civilization could erase himself almost completely, then how many other stories have been lost to time? How many rulers, thinkers, or events have been buried beneath the weight of deliberate forgetfulness, chaos, or destruction? This raises a question we cannot answer easily. If history can be erased, how much of what we know is missing? Every artifact, every text, every monument that survives represents only a fraction of what once existed. And every fragment we uncover is a miracle, a bridge to the past that refuses to stay silent. Now it's your turn to reflect. Why did this king erase himself? Was it fear of the future, guilt over the past, a desire for ultimate control, or something else entirely? Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. Debate, speculate, engage, because memory survives not just in archives or manuscripts, but in the minds and conversations of those who think deeply about it. And if this story has captured your curiosity, stay tuned. Next week, we will explore another ruler who history tried to hide, another figure whose deeds were deliberately erased, whose legacy was almost lost, and whose story challenges everything we believe about power, memory, and immortality. Because the past is never fully silent. It waits for those willing to listen. History can be rewritten, monuments can be destroyed, and names can be forgotten. But stories, when uncovered, have the power to transcend even kings themselves.